So we got the Danger Ranger, and I started on it last night. It was dark, so I didn't really record much, but we can look under here and see what I did so far. First off, disconnect the battery. 2 exhaust bolts there. The exhaust comes all the way back here and just joins there. So 2 there, that whole midsection just comes right out. Then I dropped the subframe bolts while holding the transmission up. This is the subframe here. And there's a part that the twisted around. Transmission slides in there. The exhaust hangs, oh no, exhaust hangs in this. And so just took that whole mid pipe out, undid O2 sensors, unscrewed this O2 sensor. I undid the drive shaft bolts back there. And then I basically dropped these 3 bolts here that go into the side of this. And that's the brace for the transmission. So basically I dropped all those. Then I just popped the linkage off of the transmission here. Just popped it off. Then I undid these connectors. This connector here had like these metal tabs on the side. I just kind of pried them up with a screwdriver very gently. And then there's a couple more connectors there. And then a bracket here that I took off. That's for this, okay. And then now I'm about to tackle the starter. I got one of the transmission bolts out up there to take off. It's actually one of the bell housing bolts, and it doubles. It also had a bracket on it. So here's the starter. That's gonna come out next and should give me the access right here to the torque converter bolts. So then I'm gonna go after the, bell housing bolts, and that's about where we are. A couple connectors here on the brace. This one here, went here. And so drive shaft's still in for now. When I pull it out, fluid will go everywhere, so I'll try to catch that. But basically that's where I'm at. Oh, and I disconnected the battery first. And so I was trying to get to that torque converter bolt there, and I was working on it forever, and I couldn't get a socket to even fit in there. And then I was about defeated, and then I realized that this is a rubber grommet piece and it comes out. And so now you can get a socket on it very easily, as a matter of fact. So, oh man. All right, so if you come in through the wheel well, I took off the front wheel, and you come in here, that's where you take the starter out. The starter would be right there, and that's where you access the holes that have the bolts on, the nuts on them for the torque converter. And that's the only place you can access them from. And I guess it makes sense because it's a really, really skinny flex plate. And so the block is deeper than the flex plate, so there's nowhere to really get in there anyway. So that starter hole is the only place. But yeah, I dropped the transmission. I actually left the torque converter on and just pulled the transmission off of it this time, just for fun. You probably should just take the 14 millimeter nuts off first. There's 4 of them, and I sat under the car and I held the crank with a big socket, and then I used my other hand, and I kind of scissored it. I pushed, I pulled, I guess it would be down. Let's see. No, I pushed up on the socket that was on the back side here, and held the crank one still with the other arm, and I broke all 4 of those loose. And you really want to be careful about that. I've had it on the Mustang where I stripped one of these torque converter bolts, and I already had the engine out of the car because I was pulling the engine anyway, but if that happens, you might have to pull the engine to get to it. Well, in this case, you might be able to rotate it down and get a drill and drill it off, but it's a nightmare, so you just don't want to do that. But anyway, got all the bell housing bolts off. There's a bunch of them on the back side. That's kind of a new thing. They're on, like, the Mustang, the starter has them on the back side, and there's, like, you know, 2 on the little shield on the bottom. But this one, there's a bunch of bell housing bolts, and on this side there were a bunch that came in from the front. And so I got that all done. You know, the vent tubes, it's bolted up, this little bracket hole here, it's bolted into the top transmission bell housing hole, so it kind of doubles with that. And I left the drive shaft in so it wouldn't spill fluid everywhere. It did puke a bunch of fluid out onto the carpet here, which is why I'm glad it didn't throw this carpet away yet. But basically, I got the transmission down and out of the way, and the starter had 3 bolts on it. There's 2 on the back here, 1 on the front, and I could get a socket up there to get that off. So pretty simple, pretty straightforward if you've done anything like this before. And we've got a replacement transmission here, and it has the torque converter in there already, and yeah, looks pretty good. So we'll take it to that point. I'll put the cross member in the back and the wheel in the back. So the dipstick tube came right out. I saw a guy really struggled with this on his transmission. It has an O-ring here, but it just slid right out. So in the dipstick, I think it's just held up by that itself. I didn't see an anchor up there, so that's something to look out for. I did use a 16 millimeter like rounded pipe socket, or sorry, wrench that I got these transmission lines out with, and they just threaded out really easy. And we'll look at the starter here. So where the starter bolted in, one of the starter bolts had a nut that held this ground to it. I believe it was the top one. And then there was a bolt that went in here. There's a straight shot to here, and then the 2 down there and up there were the other 2 starter bolts. I wasn't sure if this transmission's new torque converter had fluid in it already. I called the number on this tab. They couldn't tell me anything about that, so I went ahead and took it off, and sure enough, it was empty. And so I feel like it's better to add the fluid to it instead of have the pump try to put it all in there. It's probably better to do it that way first. And then when you get everything all installed, you hold the brake on, start it, and you just kind of run it through all the gears until it pumps fluid into it and gets firm. Now, something I would like to mention is how deep the torque converter sits inside the transmission bell housing area there. You can see that little anchor bolt piece, that tag, is straight down and then it curves in, and you can see how it holds that torque converter inside there. Now when you take a torque converter on and off, there's splines that it needs to line up with, and sometimes you'll put it in but it won't go all the way back, so you might have to wiggle it and move it around a little bit and clock it back and forth until it finally goes on deeper. So I just want to make that clear that that torque converter needs to be far back on there, because I've had a time where it was on but it wasn't deep enough on a automatic Mustang, and then when I went to mate the transmission and engine together, it was binding the torque converter against the block. So that torque converter needs to be pushed back. And even though I filled the torque converter with fluid, it still needed the rest of the fluid filled in through the dipstick tube once it's all installed. And it took several quarts. I think it recommended like 10, but I put in like 8 or something. Just be careful and add as you go. But once the car runs, it's going to suck some more fluid into that torque converter. So you'll need to keep a careful eye on the level. And remember to have the drive shaft in
when you add fluid, make sure you have it to that point at least, because if the drive shaft's still out of it and you add fluid, it'll spill out the tail shaft.
All right, old transmission's out. This vent tube was actually replaced by one of those cap ones. I don't know if you can see it up there, but it has like a cap. But anyway, like a breather. So just put the transmission all back up in, got it lined up, got the bell housing bolts straight, got the torque converter bolts lined up. And that's really important, because if you put the torque converter bolts or studs through the flex plate and then you take the nuts and tighten those down, it could pull the torque converter forward and then it binds up and it's all messed up. So you got to put the bell housing on first, get that all tightened down straight, and make sure that the holes for the torque converter and the flex plate line up, which you do through here like I showed you earlier. So there's the red torque converter, and yeah, still have a socket on here so I can turn the engine. There it is, see? Got all four of those on nice and tight. And now it's time for the exhaust. So exhaust is gonna go back up in, and then the transmission brace. And I filled the torque converter with fluid. I did show that. And then, just trying to think, now I'm gonna add fluid and run it through the gears, park, neutral, drive, park, neutral, drive, all that stuff. And that'll pump fluid into it. So, got the drive shaft on. That was good. Got Loctite on the drive shaft bolts.
Right, so I got everything all back together, Loctite on the drive shaft bolts, everything like that. So that's just kind of a quick flyover, real quick, to get an idea of what you're looking at when you replace the transmission on this. Very similar to the Mustang, so pretty cool. But anyway, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and stay tuned for more Mustang and Ford content.